Hello, this is Adrian Shepard from Springtime Nations. I'm here today with a very interesting guest, Jeremy Kauffman. He's the founder of Libertarian, Odyssey. He was the 2022 Senate candidate for U.S. Senate in New Hampshire, and he's formerly a board member of the Free State Project. So, Jeremy, I'm so happy to have you here. I hope I got all your accolades correctly.
Accolades, sort of whatever the opposite of accolades would be. There's a long list of things. But I'm excited to talk to you because I've looked at some of the things that you're putting out there, and they're very related to the kinds of things that I'm interested in, and the work that I've been doing both in New Hampshire and on the internet. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation.
Right? Yeah. The thing that really got me thinking about wanting to reach out to you is I was watching the debate you did at PorcFest 2023, whether it was easier to convert a person to homosexuality or to libertarianism. Well, I believe your argument was homosexuality is not really heritable at all. It is a little bit technically, and people aren't sure why that is, but generally speaking, it's not, right? People are homosexual for some formal reasons. People think it's like social conditioning, et cetera, many theories. But the important thing is political ideology is actually very, very heritable. And if only a very small number of people are libertarian, that implies that there's kind of a libertarian gene, or it's something like that. And that sort of implies that if we can't convert everyone because they don't have this disposition, that we need to geographically concentrate. And that sort of points to a very scientific basis for the Free State Project, political migration to New Hampshire. And I think it got me thinking, and I termed the email I sent to you libertarian ethnogenesis, because I think this can be the basis of a, quote, ethnogenesis, aka the creation of a new ethnicity, if you like. Obviously, libertarians are not all the same race or from the same places geographically, but as in the case with, for example, Jews or Mormons or the Amish, when people geographically concentrate and sort of mingle as an effect of like shared affinity, that actually starts to change their genome. Like, we know that the Amish and the Jews have a lot of different genetics originally. People come from Iraq will have some differences in genetics from, Ashkenazi Jews who were mainly from Eastern Europe. But now that they live in Israel, and even before, whenever Jews were geographically concentrated, there was kind of a creation of a more homogeneous genome for them. And I wonder if that is a long-term, should that be a long-term goal of libertarianism, to create like a libertarian nation, not just like a civic nation, but sort of an ethnic nation, because of our genes.
So I think that is directionally correct in some ways. It overstates probably some things that I would personally believe, but the idea that there are real differences between libertarians and people who aren't libertarians is something that I believe very much. The idea that there is almost certainly some basis in our beliefs that is hereditary. I think that's almost certainly true, and that libertarianism is not rational for everyone, nor can you persuade everyone of it. I think that's very much true. And so, yeah, those things do lean towards something like, if you want to put it in the most obnoxious way possible, something like a libertarian Zionism, or yes, these types of libertarian concentration, movements. I don't think I do think that the evidence would say that heredity of homosexuality is closer to other political impulses like inclination to egalitarianism and various things. Like the evidence is that these things are, it's not that they can't be moved. It's just that they're substantially and meaningfully, hereditary. And so I do think, it is important to remember that all of this stuff is multi-causal. But the evidence that there are differences, and Jonathan Haidt is another guy here where he talks about people's various moral flavors, moral inclinations, this idea that our logical reasoning sort of sits on top of these values and exists to justify them. I think that is very true, and that is why when libertarians and whatever you want to call them, a statist, an authoritarian, we encounter these people who have different values from us. We have all these arguments that we want to throw at them, but no one moves one another, and that's because our rational arguments are just sitting on top of our sort of ethical impulses that are decently not rationally determined. Maybe with the right upbringing, education, you can instill them. Maybe you can send someone to the gulag and change them. And that's another important aspect of these heredity estimates, right? Like, they're not saying that in all cultures, for all experiences, this is 30% heredity or 30% hereditary or 50% hereditary or whatever. They're saying in the existing cultural sort of climate, which in the case of these studies is largely like, middle-class Americans, this appears to be how hereditary, things are. So that is another important aspect with these estimates. It's not necessarily a statement that these things are fixed, either. So I just want to give the correct view of it, or the view of it that I see. I'm also not an expert. I'm an amateur person who's interested in in these things, and that's sort of the view how I see it. But yeah, it does lean towards like we have genuine differences between us, and honestly, people don't even have to buy that it's genetic. If people believe that the differences are genuine and somewhat fixed, at least in adulthood, I think that's sufficient to imply the strategy that libertarians should concentrate their forces and attempt to enact a space somewhere that's aligned with their values, rather than trying to change things across America or across the world.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to potentially put words in your mouth.
No, you weren't. I'm just I'm a pedant, and I assumed that this kind of conversation is the one where we're being all intellectual and pedantic. So I can switch to shitposting mode, but it seemed like we're being in serious scientific mode. So I wanted to, I just wanted to get it correct as I see it.
Sure, no problem with that. I kind of had a follow-up question. So whatever this thing is, this thing that makes people like us libertarian, do you, like you said, you're an amateur. I'm not necessarily expecting you to have an answer or, a really thought out answer. But I was wondering, where does this come from? Who was where does the libertarian disposition come from historically or, geographically?
Well, look, it's like a maybe assume where this is going. I mean, I think it's probably likely true that there are different distributions of inclination to libertarianism among different types of people, both gender and races or ethnicities. But I think it's also clear that there are libertarians, everywhere of all types, And so I think if you're saying that I want to build a libertarian nation or a libertarian society, what you want to be doing is saying, well, how can I select on those characteristics? And if it turns out that I'm selecting more people from Europe than Nigeria or whatever, that's perfectly fine. But you should be trying to get, there's great libertarians all around the world, and so it's about finding how you can select for libertarians Although, so to my view of things is generally, if we have to be talking about 1 million people, then it's rational to talk about statistical abstracts. But when we have the ability to talk about, individuals, there's always individuals, and so it makes sense to do, everyone that way.
Yes, and you're being very polite, but I think you're guarding against something that I am not trying to imply.
Okay.
Genuine, just curiosity, because I've thought about this too. I mean, if someone had asked me, where does libertarian come from? Like, classical liberalism, like, all I would be able to say is, it seems like, England, specifically Scotland, and like the Netherlands seem to have been like the kind of like hotspots for this kind of thinking.
Well, look, I have no problem having a politically incorrect, conversation. Like, I think libertarians should be able to say that if certainly, like, as a resident of New Hampshire, I have no problem saying that if 500 million Africans were selected at random, that New Hampshire would be a less libertarian state, as a result. But if I could select the 10,000 most libertarian Africans, New Hampshire would be a much more libertarian state. And so, I think it's crazy that the first statement is something that people would, clip and find, offensive in some way, when it's like, look, this is just true. And, that's certainly where it drives me crazy. It's like, all right, like, I don't care. It's like getting mad, when, that about some, blasphemy. And I say, well, all right, like, you don't have to like it, but like this, you can't get mad at reality. You just can't get mad at reality. It's not a healthy disposition to have.
Yes, and I genuinely think all libertarians everywhere should geographically concentrate, and that doesn't matter like what their other, like their ethnic, religious, etc. doesn't really matter, because if we care about libertarianism and we think that it is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, that would like separate people. And I am of that general opinion that worrying about, like African libertarians coming in as opposed to European Africans, regardless of like the per capita levels, I think would be silly and counterproductive.
Were you asking about the rationality of non-libertarianism or something along those lines, or you can take it another direction if you like?
We can switch topics in a second. But just to clarify, I mean, if something is heritable, and if it is, let's just grant that it is. Usually that implies that there's some kind of like lineage past, like, okay, blue eyes are heritable.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Well, I mean, this is where it gets tricky though, because it's like, it's still ultimately, a statistical function, right? Like, it's still ultimately just a distribution among the population. But like, look, you don't find, there aren't a lot of examples of sort of non-European societies that function in ways that are highly similar to European societies. And now I'm not a huge fan of of the European societies really, or even American in terms of its structure, but like, I would still find them preferable to many other places and much of the alternatives. And because when we're talking about the governance that is produced at large, I do think that relates. Right now we are talking about statistical abstracts, we're not talking about individuals. And so the sort of distribution of inclinations among a population are going to affect, the government that it gets. And that's not even a claim about intelligence, right? Or these other factors, right? Like, I think it's the data is pretty decent that Asians are probably smarter nations on average than America or European nations. But yet, nonetheless, like, it's not like it's different. There's a different kind of mean set of values across the population.
Right, and I would say probably worse from a libertarian perspective. I would rather live in a European country because I'm a libertarian than an Asian one, even if we grant that they are smart.
Yeah, probably. Right. I mean, because it's not, a lot of quote anti-libertarian impulses are not. And maybe this is, you didn't ask it, but I just wanted to say it. I think a lot of anti-libertarian impulses are not irrational. I mean, most of our behaviors, came about from evolving in these egalitarian tribes and egalitarian bands. So 200,000 years spent as hunter-gatherers, and then like 10,000 years of evolutionary history in these more hierarchical and larger societies, right? And like that's the bulk of human evolution, is those two things. And so we can see sort of the characteristics and the artifacts of both of those in our behaviors. And and so libertarians are, if anything, a bit morally weird in they're extremely low on this impulse of enforcing things on others, of enforcing conformity of beliefs, or conformity of ideas, or just pulling people down. That impulse to egalitarianism, I think that's a very, very, very big one. That where a lot of our history was in these reverse dominance hierarchies, where in these egalitarian bands, like you had a sort of a leader or sort of alpha of the band, but it was a tricky relationship. It wasn't like a strong monarchy. It was more of a delicate political dance where that guy could get ganged up on it at any time. And so this impulse to level and to sort of towards equality, that existed for a lot of our history. And you can imagine why that's a rational behavior from an evolutionary sense, right? It makes sense. You don't want to let the alpha monopolize, and so we have this impulse to level and not let and to sort of be what would the word be? Equitable, be more equitable in essentially in reproduction among the tribe. All right, and so that because everything's got to be it's got to be evolutionary. What else could it be? And so that's my thinking in terms of where that partially where that comes from.
Right, and certainly those societies that I was pointing to as the ones where classical liberalism seemed to flourish. Even there was this struggle between what was called back then liberty versus power. There was a big authoritarian faction that had to be fought, and sometimes liberty was on was winning, was separate. We were able to implement like markets,
Yeah, well, this is the left and right libertarian split, where left libertarians still, even if they say are in a right libertarian framework consistent with property rights, still find various amounts of power distance or even voluntary relationships, to be sort of inherently bad or violating in some way. Whereas an extreme right libertarian is basically okay with all kinds of sort of strong dominance, subservience, so long as it is consented. Or depending on if you're right enough and not libertarian enough, you're okay with it if it's not consented. So, and that's sort of, to me, if I had to say what's the fundamental difference of the left right, it is that sort of axis is how do you feel about these sort of power differentials inherently, and they're more triggering to some people than others. And that's not even a libertarian axis, because that difference exists within libertarianism and within libertarians themselves.
Of course. Just out of curiosity, would you identify as like right wing, like right with a capital R libertarian?
I mean, I would write it with a lowercase r, but yes, I consider myself a right-wing libertarian. I also consider myself a progressive, so I like to say just to really mix people up. But I'm not a conservative either. So I'm a right-wing progressive libertarian is what I am.
By progressive, are you referring to your like social beliefs?
And in general, that I'm very comfortable with experimentation at the level of society. I'm comfortable with I don't like the trans stuff, but I'm morally okay with. Yeah, it's just like I'm not. It doesn't super bother me, especially if you're not being in my face about it. Transhuman stuff, people just being weird. Scientific, futurism, this kind of stuff. And I'm not like super into these things, but I'm completely comfortable with them. I don't think, while I live my life with a relatively, somewhat traditional, gendered relationship and so on. I don't have this strong belief that like, this is the way things are and this is the way that things should be. I just think, if there's just not enough evidence, there's not some better way. But I had that attitude of a scientific progressive of like wanting things to be, better. I don't long for the past. I'm not, if I'm return memeing, it's like mostly as a joke. I'm someone who believes that, the best is coming and is ahead of us and is coming from us, building new and better, better things. I like cities, like all this stuff. So I think every city sucks, but like I think it'd be nice if we could live at greater density than everyone having 10 acres and find a way to make it work. So
okay, interesting. I guess that fits in with your interest in like crypto.
Yeah, so people, that's also where I'm like very anti-progressive. I'm very anti, like in the traditional sense. Of like the left-wing person. I'm very anti-woke. I have a tendency to dig in on issues when I think people are being stupid about them, even if it's unpopular, which leads to some of the topics that, I beat the drum for. And so there are other things that get associated with that people assume would be my beliefs, and that's not always the case. So, I'm probably a bit heterodox for any specific bucket, but I do consider myself right-wing. And I'm definitely a libertarian, so that means I'm a right-wing libertarian, unquestionably.
I would also identify as a right libertarian. Some of the people in our channel are a little more closer to like plumb line anarcho-capitalism than people interested in, for example, Hans Hermann Hoppe. What do you think about the idea of like, okay, do you think that left libertarian, and by left libertarian, I don't mean I mean like left Rothbardians, mutualists, left-wing market. Do you think they, one, have a place in a libertarian community like the Free State Project? And two, do you think that, like, if they have a place, like, can there really be like collaboration, compatibility with these two like sides of libertarians?
A mixed bag. There are some people in this category that I've worked, well with. Like there's some people in this category that, participated in my campaign for, for example, and this kind of thing. And so I definitely would, there's certainly not like, enemies or things like this, right? Like if there's the biggest problem that I end up having with people in this category is like, I think they're a bit naive about certain aspects of human nature. Like the biggest problem with their set of beliefs is like other people aren't them, right? Like a lot of this sort of like mutualist and stuff, it's like, well, sure, if everyone was like you, like that would work, right? And they kind of can't get past that. And so they tend to, and so because they're so strongly rejecting of differences and can't accept hierarchy and some of the things that are just quite frankly necessary to getting things done, and if they can't, and so therefore like they tend to struggle. So, it's the same kind of thing as like, well, like socialist run, cooperative grocery stores, like just, you'll see them form occasionally and they end up closing because they're just not really competitive in the marketplace. And so, that's sort of my problem with, and that's also why these people end up drifting. They tend to drift into just becoming critics because their ideas don't really work. So that's my sense. I may not being too harsh because I do think a lot of them are like actually good people in the sense that I would get along with them and wouldn't, or at least could be amicable, socially with them and don't see them as like a threat, to me or some of the things that I would want. So that's I guess that's where I'd be at on that crowd.
Okay. So I do want to, you mentioned in your first response, to use, it's like, well, you use like, to use the most obnoxious way to put it, a libertarian Zionism. And certainly like past couple of weeks, as relating to the Free State Project or any political migration and concentration of libertarians And certainly in the past couple of weeks, in the weeks that we've been trying to set this up, definitely Zionism has become a little more of a touchy subject among libertarians, I would say, and everyone. But I do think that there hasn't been anything close to what we're trying to do in New Hampshire other than Zionism. Like, there's nothing at the same kind of scale has ever been done with like creating intentional communities, organizing these communities into what eventually became a nation state. Not saying we should make a state necessarily, but I think if people who take the Free State Project idea seriously, I think we should seriously study the lessons of Zionism. What do you think about that?
I essentially completely agree. So first, part of the usage of the provocative phrasing is that you get distribution. It gets at least now people are engaging with your idea. So I'm not opposed to it. You've got to learn from what works, and Israel, I think, is one of the most interesting nations in the world. And while I would not endorse many of the things that Israel does, I would still consider myself a Zionist in the sense that I think it is good that Jewish people have a country, so long as they want one and are abiding by various norms or whatever. So like it's such a large world that if there's millions of people of practically any belief, like we ought to be able to exchange property and have ways of these people being able to live as they desire. So I'm very much not a universalist. And so when I see right-wing people, especially that are critical of Israel, I can understand not liking the relationship that your own government has with Israel, but ultimately what Israel wants seems like something that's closer to what you want, right? In the sense that Israel has strong rules about who can come in and who can come out, and Israel does it in a way that mostly isn't permissible in other parts of the world, right? And so you're frustrated by this feeling that there's sort of special rules for Israel, but like it seems like the better argument would be like everyone should have these rules, or like this should be this should be more normal. I don't want a Christian nationalist America, but like I totally support a Christian nationalist state. Like there's a lot of Christian nationalists. Like why can't there be one explicitly strongly Christian nation in the world? That seems like it should be allowed. Like let the Mormons actually have Utah. It just seems like this kind of attitude would be better in general. And so that's the attitude, I think, like, and these right-wing people who want that, and then they, some of them do take that attitude towards Israel. Some of them sort of break, but it feels like it's partially out of like jealousy. Like Israel has this thing that I don't.
Right. I do want to carry on with the Zionism stuff, but I don't want to lose this thread. I mean, the idea that there should be, quote unquote, a Christian nationalist state or Mormon state, both. So our channel is very focused on the idea of pan-secessionism. I don't know. Are you familiar with that term?
Not strongly, but I saw it, looking at your channel coming into this.
Mm-hmm. So basically, our idea is for a strategy, and this strategy is very focused on the Free State Project, on like as a libertarian, like homeland, basically. But if we're going to be successful, that we need to start working with non-libertarian groups all over the U.S. and all over the world, kind of promoting this idea of self-determination. And it can be ethnic, it could be religious, it could be, in our case, obviously, and in the case of like Mormonism, kind of like an affinity-based nationalism. But it's trying to avoid like the nightmare scenario, which is we get this thing, there's a million libertarians in New Hampshire, right? And the U.S. is like not happy with it. sanctioning it, or it's trying its hardest to basically keep us down, and so we secede, and then the United States like crushes us, right? Obviously, not what we want to happen. And the Pan-secessionist program would be working with, for example, Native American sovereignty advocates, Mormons, Christian nationalists, national redoubtists, Black nationalists, as many people as we can, like, come up with Quebec nationalists, because New Hampshire is right over the St. Lawrence, or Quebec is right over the St. Lawrence. But having like this kind of like coalition of people that want out of the empires. I think the example of Burma is great, because in the Burmese Civil War, you have all these different ethnic groups fighting the state, along with like liberals who don't like the military junta, but they're all fighting for their own ethnic autonomy. There's not, other than the liberals, but they're kind of more focused in the cities anyway. But all these ethnic groups in rural communities in the mountains, they want, at the very least, a federalized or confederal Burma, and in many cases, they just want their own nations. But they're kind of fighting together against, Leviathan. And I think that kind of strategy, in my opinion, my friends who run the channel with me's opinion, this is the best strategy, like, for the future, is working with non-libertarian groups to free each other from central authority.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great idea. I think it gives you a way to coalition with people outside your movement that you wouldn't otherwise be able to coalition with. It's also, I found, an argument that people are like way more receptive to than libertarianism itself. This idea that, well, people who hold beliefs that you don't have want to live in a way different from you in a place far away from you. Like, you could get into some specific beliefs that might trigger them, and smart people might start to come up with counterexamples about what if this or that started happening. But for the most part, it's something that people are very receptive to, and it's also one of the things that's sort of unique about our modern era is frontiers don't really exist anymore. And I guess that's been true for longer than just our modern era, but it's still relatively new in human history that there's not really any frontier that people could go to settle, even if they have to build up from scratch to do something different. And so that really leaves not much of an option other than to attempt to, there are attempts for new frontiers with free cities and various things, and so maybe some of those things will come through, but absent that, under the current framework, like, strongly concentrating and evolving the system through concentration does seem like one of the very few possibilities available, to do this kind of thing. And the more that idea can be seeded, ideological self-assortment, that we can't work these things out. It's better we go different ways. It's better we go find and live among people that share our values. Like, the more that idea is propagated, the more it will also happen. And I guess one other thought here, I'm just kind of going randomly, is it is already happening. It's happening naturally. People do it. People look up and sort themselves out. And that dynamic is one of those things that has conditions which can lead to acceleration, right? Where, because even if if it starts relatively slow marginally, like if each cycle is getting larger, you could have greater than linear growth, right? And you'd have exponential growth of sort of dynamics in this space. And I don't know if that's happening yet, so I'm not making the strong claim that we're seeing this happen exponentially yet. But it could be. This is something where it can tip, and there are examples in history of this kind of thing happening, where if something tips strongly, 20 or 30 years can be a lot of time, and a lot of things can change, and so we may go through a period like that over the next several decades.
Right. I think you make a very good point. couple good points, but especially like the idea that like, yeah, people going their own way is way more popular than specifically Murray Rothbard was correct when he was writing in 1960. And that makes it easier to work together with non-libertarians. I have a question sort of relating to this and with the idea of libertarian Zionism. So Zionism obviously had growing and then basically almost universal, not quite universal, but extremely high support among Jews by the time the state of Israel eventually became founded. But it probably would not have gotten that far, at least at that point, without non-Jews who supported Zionism. And so the question, I'll try to like make this like how translating this into like our project, the Libertarian Zionist project. How do we get our like Gentiles to see New Hampshire as like libertarian Zion? Like, how do we get them to say, "Oh, this is where they belong"? So,
this if you're saying to learn from history, I mean, the history of Israel is one in which a lot of people did not want Jews as neighbors. Like, anti-Semitism was not a phenomenon local to Germany. There was much more anti-Semitism in basically every country, I think, at this time. And, so part of the reason that Israel was sort of ended up being an agreed upon solution was people were like, well, everyone was like, well, I don't want the Jews, It was a lot of countries going around, and it's like, well, all right, well, we'll give it, well, let's do that, and so, it's, if your goal, and this is, I'm not saying that this is like morally correct or good, but like people aren't going to people aren't going to uproot their lives if they're comfortable where they are. If people are uncomfortable where they are, if they feel morally alienated, if they feel unsafe, if they feel threatened, those are the kinds of things that cause people to change their lives. COVID, in the sense of, if you're a libertarian Zionist, COVID was good for libertarian Zionism. It caused more people to get up and move and concentrate in different places. So that's uncomfortable, I think, but that is the truth in terms of what accelerates this the most is is discomfort as much as the appeal of New Hampshire is and I think obviously New Hampshire has a lot of appeal, or just in general, if you're not if it's not New Hampshire only, just whatever better places, like there is positive appeal, and there is a lot of benefit socially to having more people who share your values around you and so on. But it's like, it's not like the state's going to go away. It's not like the actual differences in government on the scale of all possibilities is like, it's real, but not tremendous. There's real benefit, but it's substantially aspirational as well. And so, whereas if someone is frustrated because their kids don't go on play dates anymore because all the parents around them are, have gone insane, that's a really strong reason to get out of where you are, right? Because you all of a sudden, these moral differences that you have, which can be like, they're not surfacing all the time. I spent a decade living, among people where very few of the people that I saw on a regular basis were libertarians. They were nice people. They were intelligent people. They weren't libertarians. And, occasionally there would be issue X or Y that would come up, and it could be uncomfortable to bite my tongue, or it would be clear that we saw things differently. But I didn't have a problem getting along with those people or regarding those people as friends, And so that's a lot of libertarians. That's where they're at. They might believe the ideas in their head, but they have a comfortable life. Things are going okay for them. Why would I want to move to Israel?
Right. And of course, in a sense, Zionism isn't completely successful. I mean, you could even say it's only like half successful, right? Half of all Jews in the world live in Israel, half live other places, mostly in the U.S. I guess.
Yeah, although I don't think Israel considered I would think you would want both, right? So I don't know.
Right. Well, maybe you said libertarians want both. I wonder.
I mean, right now, I feel like we are so early, still, even though what's here now compared to a decade ago is tremendous, where now it feels like we're probably going to succeed, but it's a question of time scale. And earlier it was, who knows if this thing will even work. It's, I don't know, it feels like it still feels very early at the same time. So.
Yeah. So relating to Zionism, I have a couple questions still on this thing. So if we move, when we move, and we've started to see this over the past decade, just like when Jews started moving into Israel, started creating tension with the people who were there and were not Jewish. And you get this people complaining about free staters. What do we do about the tension created by our political migration?
Is this with family and friends that aren't libertarians, or with friends that are family or friends that are libertarian?
Let's just talk, not necessarily friends, like neighbors, who aren't libertarian. And as New Hampshire becomes more and more libertarian, and they complain about our politics, our personality, etc. What do we do about how do we solve this problem? Because obviously we don't want to solve it the way that Israel did, right?
Oh, you mean if there's conflicts between a libertarian nation and its neighbors,
or the people who were the native? Yeah.
Well, so I mean, there. I was just at this Free Cities conference in Prague and talking to these Free Cities people. And some of them were expressing this sort of confusion around why some people were so offended by their ideas. And it relates back to that impulse of egalitarianism and that leveling impulse, because it is an implicit rejection of them in some sense. At least some people will receive it this way psychologically. Right, in the sense that you are saying that you don't like, it's so bad here, or you don't like this so much, because that triggers the sort of cognitive dissonance in them that, are they supposed to do it, And so, one way of resolving that can be that there's some problem with you, or that you're doing something wrong. But I mean, I don't know. That's a variety of things. I mean, if your neighbors aren't your friends, what does it matter? And you're going to be leaving. What is the concern about their how they think about you? Or maybe I'm missing the scenario.
So basically, okay, the people who complain about free staters and talk about the free staters taking over New Hampshire.
Oh, in New Hampshire, when you move to New Hampshire, your neighbors thinking this?
Yeah, and how to I mean, it's not we're not gonna stop being libertarian.
Oh, I see. No. So look, very, very few people actually think that. The people who think that are predominantly the very the sort of far left. They're going to be there's maybe this other population of sort of low information Democrats who are now seeing messaging about this. But look, if you go and you be a good neighbor, your neighbors aren't going to dislike you. They're not going to believe, and if anything, that's the exact kind of act, that fixes that kind of disinformation problem. But honestly, it's mostly you're a Republican. And I know we're not that. I'm not trying to say that we are just Republicans, but there's not, most people don't know, and even the people who want to foam at the mouth about it, perceive it as just the sort of general political, fear mongering. There's not this, pervasive concern. And I think that there can be fear similar to literally any group hearing that the natural impulse, some new ethnic group is coming in, or some new population that feels different, is to be concerned. And so even if there's polling data or reaction that expresses concern, that melts away through exposure and experience, the same as any other irrational, prejudice would. That's what actually kills irrational prejudice. And so, it's really only a couple of democratic groups that are clearly political that are trying to like gin people up. Like the average person is like very checked out and would have no idea. And there's a lot of people, of course, who are very glad. I mean, that's the other thing is, it's most some Republicans don't know about it either, of course, but Republicans who have heard about it, they're going to generally be positive. So it's really not that different than another kind of right-left coded thing. Even if the Free State Project is supposed to be libertarian and be, above being right-left or whatever.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear that it's not so much of a problem. Okay. So, yeah, when you were discussing that, that COVID, for example, or some other like heightening of political tensions, just in general in the United States, or, financial problems, like bad things happening, can work in our favor, which is, I think, true and a good point. But it's sort of like out of our control. Do you think that there's sort of, looking at the Zionist project, when they were encouraging people to go to Israel, now obviously, like you said, there was things out of their control that made it more popular. But the Zionist ideology, like creating like the kibbutzes, having this ideology of like the new Jew that was supposed to like be like, instead of like, like cowering, assimilated, like kind of weak, and it being replaced with like this Zionist Jew when he moves to Israel and becomes like this muscular Judaism, they called it. Should libertarians kind of take that? Like, I know that there has been some messaging like saying like, oh, people who move to New Hampshire, they're doers. But if we can make it even more like basically that like libertarians outside of New Hampshire are like powerless, and kind of like basically calling back to that same kind of idea. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's related to what you said earlier about learning from what works, and I think appeals to a sense of identity do work. I think if anything, people can be lacking in that in our sort of modern, world, can be lacking in a sense of identity, can be lacking in meaning, and so I mean, even speaking for myself, I mean, I don't feel that I'm, I guess, like lacking, but I do feel that the ideas here are, something that motivates me as this kind of, transcendental, aspirational kind of thing to be, striving towards, which for me is a psychologically happy place. Like, I like it when I feel that there's something, big that I'm trying to move towards, and especially if you're also making progress towards it, which I feel like, we are. So, I will admit at the same time to like not being the greatest historian. So if there are you and the people here, if you guys are going deep on this stuff, like I'm also very interested in lessons that you might have, or ideas that you might have, from either from history or just on your own, because what we're trying to do here is very hard, and so we certainly, it's not a solved problem. It's not like we've learned. It's not like we know exactly what to do. This is uncharted territory, which means that we should be very open-minded, about strategies and approaches.
Well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say I'm like a historian of Zionism exactly. I do try to look into it, just because it is kind of our closest parasite. And I don't know how much you can talk about this, but you were on the board for a while of the Free State Project, and now you are not. And I was just thinking, your approach versus maybe the other people on the board's approach, I feel like it kind of relates to the different strains in Zionism. You had the labor Zionists like Ben Gurion, who were very like reformist minded and wanted to work with the British, and they were very conciliatory. And then you had the revisionists, who were way more immediatist. They were kind of revolutionary, and obviously they promoted, let's say, being a little more abrasive towards the British. And these aren't perfect analogies, obviously, but I feel like your style of confrontationalism and trying to get out the message, attacking what you see as like bad, like inconsistencies and bad beliefs and like bad like parts of like our movement, I think is a lot more like the revisionist strain, and the kind of the more establishment, kind of the old guard of the Free State Project is more like the labor Zionists, where they're kind of just plodding along. And both, I think, were very useful in the establishment of Israel. But I think without the revisionists, who were actually like putting people's feet to the fire, I think Israel probably would not have what I mean, first of all, like been created, and second of all, survived. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think it's a big deal. I think it overstates the divide because there's not much of one. It's really, what it really was is, a couple of people who are very out of touch. I mean, and I think that generally the reaction, showed that both publicly as well as the reaction that's happened, internally here that a lot of people can't see. So, yeah, I mean, I think the whole thing is silly, but I also think it's counterproductive for me to, be kind of like, harping on it, because it's not like there's any actual control that the organization, has. It's not like the organization is a relatively small, cog in everything that's going on here, overall. So, I also think it's something that will hopefully work itself out, over time. So those are my thoughts on it. I mean, there definitely are differences. And I think it's a shame at a minimum. Like, one thing that really frustrates me in libertarian circles is it's like when people can't acknowledge them, right? Like, I have no problem acknowledging my differences with the left libertarians, and I have different circles of concern. I had these different beliefs for different reasons. My moral calculus is different. And I could articulate like where we differ, but so many people want to have this argument as like, well, but I'm right and you're wrong. And it's like, well, I don't even know. Like, we just had I'm very skeptical of this idea that there's, some objective, moral truth that's there in all times and all cases. I think a lot of this stuff is things that were impulses that were given to us, largely through evolution, but also that we're conditioned as well. But like either way, like, this is not, if we can't even recognize this, it's like, where are we going to go? And so it's hard for me. I accept that, when I sort of, in my business spaces, right, in my professional spaces, there's I demand a sort of a sense of epistemology, a certain way of being able to think about things and approach things, because it's difficult for me to exist outside of those spaces. And at times I can forget that, like, just a lot of people struggle with it. A lot of people get emotional over silly things. People don't want something to be true, and they just get triggered emotionally and they react emotionally. And I think that, or something else, but this is stuff in that space of things. And I don't think it's going to really affect the movement or the project, very much overall.
Great. I think that's a great response. I've noticed that you've really not been like, oh, woe is me, I've been like maligned this way or whatever. And I think that is a very negative thing about like the recent management of a lot of these libertarian organizations. They air their dirty laundry on Twitter. I find that very unprofessional.
Well, I agree. Although, of course, I could be accused of just doing this and participating in it. But I actually agree.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, the FSP isn't the movement. right? It's an organization, and it might even be an important organization, but ultimately, I mean, you could just as easily have a bunch of like the same kind of organization, could be founded like tomorrow or whatever. Not to take away what they've done, but it's not the movement. It's just an organization, just in like with Zionism, right? When there was a breakup, if you're still moving towards the same goals, ultimately, like having 2 or 3 or 10 organizations that may have like vocal disagreements is fine as long as you're moving towards the same goal.
Yeah, I essentially agree with that. I mean, my recommendation here, and by the way, I've got to go in a little bit, but my recommendation here is like, I don't think things should never be aired out publicly. In fact, I have a very specific norm I've been trying to push here internally to mix success, which is like, basically first, the expectation should be that like, if you've got a beef or you've got a problem with someone, that you try to talk it out with that person, one-to-one, because it's not helpful to have the public call-outs. And then 2, if that's not working, then you should try to have some kind of, either like most likely private, although it could be public, but some kind of like mediated discussion or some kind of discussion with third parties, where you're getting feedback rather than it becoming this, all the way to, this full-on public fight. And then if those things don't work and you still have the beef, fight it out, right? Because I don't think you can't have a movement where there's never public fighting. What you've got to have a movement is, well, like public fighting, happens only after it can't be worked out, privately. And then you've got to have it out publicly. And so I wish, like in my case, I spent weeks, months, I could tell that there were frictions. I didn't realize as bad as they were, but I was pushing. I was like, hey, can we do, a summit? Can we do some research? Because to me, and this is of course where I was being me and I didn't realize where other people were at in their own heads, I'm still being the scientist. I'm still assuming that these are empirical questions, about what works or what not, that these are about questions of strategy, when in reality they had become personal, as with people who had become emotionally triggered by various statements that I had said under my own name, under my own account, and that they were just in mental meltdown space towards me personally, and I just didn't. Admittedly, this was my fault and my mistake. I didn't read that situation correctly, and that's what I was dealing with.
Right. Well, I hope the situation, as he said, resolves itself. Jeremy, you mentioned that you had to go soon, so thanks for your time. I think this was a really productive conversation. I'd love to have you again on sometime.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.